Now, some of this, it takes a little bit of historical knowledge to go through.
You bet it does, David. You bet it does.
I'll just quickly run through this. There were three tribes, the Vandals, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. They were Arian tribes. That is to say, they denied the preeminence of Jesus Christ. Okay, and basically what happened is the Bishop of Rome got on the phone to a man named Justinian, the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, and he said, I've got these three tribes over here that are giving me a hard time. They deny the teachings of the church, and what happened is, the short version is very short, Justinian came over and thrashed those kingdoms because the Bishop of Rome said they don't agree with us theologically.
Okay, a couple things. First, Justinian is credited with thrashing the Vandals and Ostrogoths. That's true. However, as I mentioned in my Kenneth Cox series, Justinian was a young boy at the time Odovacar's Heruli kingdom came to an end in 493 AD. Emperor Zeno commissioned that war. Rather than seeking their destruction, Justinian aided in the Heruli's conversion to Chalcedonic Orthodoxy after becoming emperor. David, a little bit of historical knowledge, as you put it, would have told you that. Second, I have not found any records showing that the Roman bishops contacted the emperors in order to uproot those three Arian tribes, and contemporary writers made no mention of a papal conspiracy. They fully credit the emperors for instigating those conflicts, and the Byzantine rulers had their own reasons for wanting to reconquer the western provinces. But I tell you what, since David is so pressed for time, let's take a look at some of the evidence I've seen used by Adventists that supposedly reveals the papacy as the man behind the curtain, and we'll see where that leads us.
Nearly all the wars which the northern barbarians carried on in Italy, it may be here remarked, were occasioned by the pontiffs, and the hordes with which the country was inundated were generally called in by them.
On page 13, Machiavelli admits after the Lombards divided Italy in 568, the Pope had an opportunity of greater exertion. He goes on to say that later threats from the Slavs, Persians, Saracens, and Turks caused the distressed Pope to seek the aid of the King of France in the 8th century. And it is in this context Machiavelli made the claim about nearly all of the Italian conflicts being started by the pontiffs. Now, I agree to an extent. The northern barbarians, like the Franks or Normans, were certainly involved with the popes beginning in the 8th century. The historical record supports papal involvement in those conflicts, and this is what Machiavelli was referring to in that passage. He did not have tribes like the Ostrogoths or Vandals in view. Christian Detmold's translation of Machiavelli's work confirmed this when he clarified all the wars that were made by the barbarians in Italy after that time were caused by the pontiffs. But for the sake of argument, let's assume for the moment Machiavelli was blaming the papacy for the earlier invasions. The question is, does his book support that claim? It should be noted here that Machiavelli spent the first 12 pages of History of Florence detailing the various barbarian invasions of Italy that occurred between 409 and 568. And most importantly, he took the time to assign blame for each one of them, so identifying the culprit should be a fairly easy exercise. On page 2, he blamed General Stilicho for the invasion of Alaric's Visigoths, because the general had deprived them of their annual subsidy. On page 4, he blamed Attila for the invasion of the Huns. On the same page, he blamed Empress Eudocia for calling Genseric's Vandals to invade the peninsula. On page 5, he blamed Odovacar for the invasion of the Heruli and Turingi into Italy. On page 6, he blamed Emperor Zeno for giving King Theodoric permission to lead the Ostrogoths into Italy against Odovacar. Finally, on page 10, he blamed General Narses for calling in the Lombards because he was insulted by Emperor Justin and Queen Sophia. So Machiavelli could have charged individual popes with calling in any of those barbarian hordes, but as we've seen, he clearly did not do so. Now, he did mention the papacy in reference to the Huns, however, he only stated the Pope was used to negotiate the Huns' withdrawal from the peninsula, not their invasion. The fact of the matter is, I have not found a single contemporary writer who expressed papal culpability for calling in the Germanic hordes of the 5th and 6th centuries, or starting the Italian conflicts that followed, and I don't know of any later historian who could espouse such a wild claim without being required to, back it up. So even if it could be shown that Machiavelli blamed the Bishop of Rome, not only would it be an unsupported opinion, but he completely failed to implicate any of the popes and document their involvement, despite devoting the first chapter of his book for that very purpose.
Before long, it was openly said that the clergy had organised a general conspiracy against Odovaker, somewhat, it would seem, in the style of the Sicilian Vespers.
Okay, the story goes, sometime around 490 AD, Italians who supported King Theodoric's cause performed a mass assassination of Odovaker's supporters throughout Italy. Valeri's account was admittedly based in part on Thomas Hodgkin's account of the same. Hodgkin cited Theodoric's biographer, Bishop Eunotius, in stating that the Vespers incident was instigated by Theodoric as revenge for General Tufa's treachery 1 year earlier. His timeline placed the slaughter of Odovaker's followers after the Battle of Ada in 490, and after he and the remains of his military were holed up within the 3 Italian cities left in their possession. At that point, Theodoric had control of virtually all of Italy, and Gothic victory was all but assured. Now, Hodgkin didn't present any direct proof of the clergy's involvement, let alone the Pope. He simply stated his opinion that the sanctimonious wording of the bishop may have inferred that the clergy were privy to the plot. However, Valeri went well beyond speculation and claimed that not only were the clergy aware of it, but they organized the coup against Odovaker. And from his wording, Valeri gave the impression that he placed the Vespers event before Tufa's betrayal and the Battle of Ada, an idea which clashes with his source, Thomas Hodgkin. But regardless, the Vespers incident was an act of revenge that did not affect the outcome of the war in any way. So even if Valeri's conspiracy were true, it would not be evidence that the Bishop of Rome was responsible for the fall of Odovaker, let alone the destruction of the Heruli. At most, it shows the Roman Church had no problem kicking Odovaker once he was down.
The gates of Rome were shut in his face, and the inhabitants of Italy began to show him marked hostility, partly on account of his recent conflict with the Church, partly for the increased deeds of spoliation.
Hodgkin explains that the story comes from a late 8th century source, almost 300 years after the fact. However, he also mentions that a contemporary 5th century writer confirmed that Odovaker went from the Battle of Verona straight to the capital of Ravenna, and Hodgkin didn't seem to find the Rome story very believable. So for those reasons, I believe the account Valeri mentioned is spurious. Now, on to the Vandals.
Justinian wavered for a time, fearing to attack these warlike Vandals, but a Catholic bishop assured him of victory, claiming he had seen a vision in which God commanded that the war should be immediately undertaken. "It is the will of heaven, O Emperor," exclaimed the bishop.
According to Procopius, Justinian was about to give up his Vandal war plans when a bishop from one of the eastern provinces told him that God had visited him in a dream. The Lord commanded Justinian to put aside fear and protect the Christians in Africa from tyrants, which he did. It's a nice convenient story, but not exactly history. Nothing points to the papacy being the one responsible for Justinian's decision. In that regard, the historical record is silent. Procopius simply said an Eastern bishop told the emperor about a vision he had. Another thing to consider is that Procopius's tale was not the only version of the account circulating at that time. There was a competing urban legend written by a contemporary chronicler named Victor of Tanuna. He said Justinian decided to execute the war against the Vandals after an African martyr named Laetus appeared to Justinian in a dream, and he urged the emperor to protect the Catholics in Africa. So we've got one writer who credited the prophetic utterance of an anonymous Eastern bishop for changing the emperor's mind, while another blamed a saintly African apparition for accomplishing the same task. It's a pretty safe bet that both accounts of supernatural intervention were simply devices used to provide a divine mandate for the invasions. Later in his secret history of Justinian, Procopius would tell us, in time of peace or truce, Justinian's thoughts were ever craftily engaged in endeavoring to find pretexts for war against his neighbors. Taking upon himself the role of God's avenging angel suited the emperor just fine. It seems far more plausible that Justinian's decision to invade Africa at that particular moment was based on achieving a temporary treaty with Persia, news that the province of Tripoli had aligned itself with the emperor, and reports that part of the Vandal military was preoccupied by a conflict in Sardinia. All of the pieces for a successful invasion were in place. Finally, we have the Ostrogoths.
The success of Justinian's invasion was due to the clergy, in the ruin they brought upon their country and the relentless tyranny they drew upon themselves. They had their reward.
Yeah, unfortunately, the only evidence Draper provided for this claim was personal commentary inserted into the page margins by either himself or a later editor, which said, "The emperor and pope conspire against Theodoric." Historical examples of this collusion were never mentioned by Draper in the book. He only insisted that conspiracies were detected in Rome against Theodoric, and rumors were whispered about that the arms of Constantinople would before long release Italy from the heretical yoke of the Arian. There can be no doubt that Theodoric detected the treason. But Draper doesn't acknowledge who exactly were behind these so-called conspiracies and rumors, whether they were senators, clergy, and most importantly, whether the Bishop of Rome had any part in it. From Procopius, we do know that the Romans Boethius and Symmachus were charged with conspiring against Theodoric. However, the prevailing opinion is the charges were bogus. Now, Draper does mention in passing that Pope John I was thrown into prison where he later died, but that was done because he failed to end the persecution of Arians in the Eastern Empire, not because of treason. I'm sure Draper knew this, which is why he mentioned the Pope's imprisonment, but not the reason behind it. I mean, think about it. Boethius was arrested around 523. If Theodoric suspected the Pope was consorting with the Emperor, he wouldn't have sent the bishop as his envoy to Constantinople almost 2 years later. You know, where even closer collusion could take place. Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. So David, to wrap this up, if you're going to claim that the Pope contacted the Emperor and got him to thrash the Arian kingdoms, would it be too much to ask for evidence of those important communications? Instead of quickly running through this, how about taking the time to document your assertion? My guess is, you can't.
Those kingdoms, the Heruli, the Vandals of Northern Africa, and the Ostrogoths are gone today. No modern descendants whatsoever. None. Fits the historical correspondence perfectly.
Yes, David, those kingdoms are gone today. Thank you, Captain Obvious. But guess what? So are all of the other barbarian kingdoms you might list. None of them exist today. They've all kicked the bucket, bought the farm. They are bereft of life. Now, David tries to get around this by equating kingdoms with descendants, suggesting that if modern descendants exist, then the kingdom does as well. However, several scholars I've read estimate that the barbarians probably made up no more than 4 to 8% of the total population within their respective kingdoms. This means that even though we refer to the kingdom of the Lombards or the Franks, the barbarians themselves were vastly outnumbered by the native populations that they govern. So determining whether or not descendants of those tribes still exist today becomes far more problematic. Of course, my sources could be wrong on those figures. This is all just conjecture on their part. But their estimates are based on available historical data, whereas people like David reach their conclusions based solely on their particular flavor of Bible prophecy. This is why many Adventists will equate modern Spain with the Visigoths, all the while completely ignoring the Ummayad Islamic state, which uprooted the Visigoths in the 8th century. The Arabs ruled the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 300 years, almost as long as the Goths. But never mind all that. Many Adventists will continue to view Spain through Visigothic lenses. Of course, that's assuming most rank-and-file Adventists have even heard of the Umayyad invasion. I certainly wouldn't take that bet. But David's statement raises an important question. How exactly does he know that the descendants of the Heruli, Vandals, or Ostrogoths are actually gone? I mean, how does being an ex-amateur skateboarder qualify him to make that kind of determination? For example, according to Procopius, several thousand Ostrogoths were allowed to leave Italy as a condition to end the war. So it's certainly possible there may be a few Europeans alive today who are connected to those remaining Ostrogoths. Or they could have been wiped out during the intervening centuries due to warfare, famine, or disease. At this point, we simply don't know. The truth is, with a few exceptions, practically all of the tribal distinctions that existed during the time of Justinian are gone today. They either melted into Western Europe's gene pool or died out completely. So barring some new anthropological breakthrough, equating entire modern European nations with 6th century Germanic tribes is ludicrous, and the extent to which we can make any connections at all may be limited to isolated communities or certain royal families. We simply don't have any clear answers at this time, and I highly doubt David has done any research in the field to prove otherwise.
This is taken from Alexander Clarence Flick, The Rise of the Medieval Church, page 168. The Bishop of Rome in the seat of Caesar was now the greatest man in the West and was soon forced to become the political...
I'm sorry, I hate to jump in here again, but why the hell does all of this sound so familiar?
Watch. To the Western world, Rome was still the political capital.
Hence the whole habit of mind, all ambition, pride, and sense of glory, and every social prejudice favored the evolution of the great city in the ecclesiastical capital. Civil as well as religious disputes were referred to the successor of Peter for settlement.
I swear, it's like these prophecy speakers are just copying off of the same set of religious cliff notes. Look, I question how it can be said the Western Church was practically free from imperial power after 330 when there continued to be Western emperors throughout most of the 4th and 5th centuries. Between 330 and 476 AD, the amount of time the Western provinces were without a resident emperor only totaled a little over 30 years. David, I have a feeling you are completely oblivious to this fact.
In other words, when Constantine took his empire and moved it from Rome to Constantinople, what we today call Istanbul, he had to leave somebody in charge. And who did he leave in charge?
Ooh, I know. Junius Annaeus Bassus. He was the Praetorian prefect during Constantine's reign. Then, after the emperor's death, the western provinces were governed by Constantine II in Gaul and Constans I in Italy. Oh, wait, that's not the answer you were looking for?
He left the Bishop of Rome in charge of that empire.
Whoa, in charge of the empire? Ooh, sorry, but I don't recall Constantine ever doing that. Even a Catholic apologist like Cardinal Manning believed Constantine's departure put the Bishop of Rome in charge only in principle. Not to mention, Manning's theory ignored the fact that there continued to be Western emperors, co-emperors, and Praetorian prefects for most of the 4th century. We'd have to wait over 400 years before the Pope was put in charge of any part of Italy, and that rule only extended over the Papal States. Nothing as vast as the former Western Roman Empire.
If you go today to the Vatican, you'll see one of the most prominent paintings there is the donation of Constantine. I mean, we all should know that. That's basic history, and that's when Constantine basically turned the Western Roman Empire over to him and said, here, it's yours. And that's exactly what Flick is saying here. This is just basic history,
Hey David, basic history, as you like to call it, would have informed you that the donation of Constantine was a forgery fabricated sometime after the 7th century. The donation itself never actually happened. The Catholic Church has since recognized the document to be a fake, regardless of that 16th century painting. So again, I'm afraid Constantine never turned the Western Roman Empire over to the Pope. However, Catholic theologians like Cardinal Manning believe that even though the donation itself did not occur, Constantine's departure from the West was ordained by God and set into motion the chain of events that would eventually lead to the papacy's rise to power during the Middle Ages. In other words, Catholics now believe Constantine's donation occurred as an indirect act of divine providence, rather than an actual historical decree. And I'm sorry, but just because Flick believed Constantine's absence made the Pope the greatest man in the West in the 4th century is not the same as claiming the Pope was put in charge of the Western Roman Empire. No, that's not what Flick was saying at all. And again, I'd just like to point out there continued to be Western emperors after the death of Constantine. Okay, so are we done? Are we finished? Because I think that pretty much covers most of the...
538, you move 1,260 years, you come to 1798. You say, well, what happened in 1798? I'll tell you what happened in 1798. A man by the name of Napoleon. You ever heard of him?
Oh, come on! Napoleon? Really?
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
He was essentially sick and tired of taking orders from the papacy.
Excuse me, David. I gotta butt in here again. What exactly was the nature of these orders the papacy was giving to General Bonaparte? I mean, you do realize that in 1798, Napoleon was still a general under the French Directory, right? He wasn't the emperor yet. You do know this, right? Because honestly, it kind of sounds like you don't, and that really makes me want to bash my head in with a brick, so... so frustrating. Tell me, David, if Napoleon was so sick and tired of taking orders from the papacy, then why does Auguste Fournier say, instead of striking at the root of Catholicism as Napoleon was instructed to do, he left the Pope entirely at liberty in all matters pertaining to religion, and Rome unmolested? See, Napoleon was a native of Corsica, an island with closer ties to Italy than to France, so Napoleon was well aware that to be strong in Italy he must befriend religion. See, David, your claim doesn't make any sense, given that when Napoleon became First Consul and had the power to extinguish the papal government in Italy, he decided to restore some of the papacy's temporal and spiritual authority, and he recognized the Bishop of Rome as the head of the Catholic Church.
And he sent one of his top generals, a man by the name of Louis-Alexandre Berthier. He sent him down there into the Vatican, and he went in, he took the Bishop of Rome off of his throne, he declared Rome the Republic, all of the properties, everything, he declared it the property and Republic of France, and people said that's the end of it.
Hey, fun fact! In the 12th century, Roman revolutionaries formed a republican government called a commune in an attempt to strip the papacy and the aristocracy of their civil power. Pope Lucius II led a small army against the commune, but was defeated and he died from wounds sustained in that battle. Did you catch that? Christians, a pope died from a deadly wound? You know, Revelation 13? A deadly wound? Anyone? Why do I bother?
That's the end of the Roman Church state. It's done. And that happened in 1798, exactly 1,260 years after that power had risen to political and ecclesiastical prominence. Are you all with me, everyone? History. Basic history.
Look, David, the period of Justinian's Reconquista clearly testifies to a significant decrease in papal authority that would last for nearly half a century. However, your church gleefully marks that same period as the embryonic birth of the papacy's political and ecclesiastical prominence, and that is something I find completely untenable. It's hard for me to take a religious interpretation seriously when it claims that a 1,260-year reign of supremacy began during Pope Vigilius's pontificate. And that's because the historical record provides evidence that his reign began an era of unparalleled Caesaropapism at the hands of the Byzantine emperors. For example, during the Council of Constantinople in 553, Justinian broke communion with Vigilius because he failed to compromise on the three chapters controversy. The Pope was placed under house arrest while the bishops loyal to him were either imprisoned or sent to the mines.
A mine!
6 months later, Vigilius capitulated, and he published a new constitutum condemning the chapters. Then there is his successor, Pelagius. He too was released from prison because he flip-flopped on the three chapters. And after Vigilius's death, Justinian rewarded Pelagius for his vacillation by making him the new Bishop of Rome, a move that greatly angered the Romans since they were given no say in his election. As a result, churches in northern Italy, Africa, and Gaul renounced communion with the Holy See. The Frankish king, Childebert, even put Pelagius through the humiliating process of signing a confession of faith, just to prove his orthodoxy to the Gallic churches. When the Pope tried to force the Italian bishops into ending their rebellion, his pleas for help were ignored by the emperor's representative, General Narses. Pope Gregory the Great also tried to end the schism, but he was blocked by Emperor Maurice, who ordered the Pope to leave the rebellious bishops alone until such time that God restored peace to Italy. As a result, the rebellion continued for another 70 years.
Yeah,
My favorite example, Pope Martin I, was arrested by order of Emperor Constans II and hauled off to Constantinople in 653. The Pope was convicted of treason, stripped of his clothes, flogged, and led through the streets of the capital loaded with chains. After suffering imprisonment for 3 months, he was exiled to Crimea, where he died 4 months later. You see, this is exactly what we would expect if direct imperial oversight impeded the papacy's growth. Remember what Machiavelli said earlier about the Lombards giving the papacy an opportunity of greater exertion? That's because the Lombards weakened Byzantine control over the peninsula, and the Romans were forced to rely on more established institutions like the Church. Autonomy, not Byzantine occupation, is what helped the papacy become the powerhouse of the Middle Ages. And if you're an Adventist who doubts that statement, then just ask yourself, why can you rattle off the names and exploits of any number of medieval popes, but you'd be hard-pressed to think of even one patriarch of Constantinople? You know, it's amusing to watch Adventists quote historians who say the papacy grew more powerful as imperial influence in the Western Empire waned, while at the same time these same Christians will claim the Pope's political prominence began in 538 AD. The same year they believe a Roman emperor held the West in his firm grip once again. Oh, the irony. And David, since you quote-mined Alexander Flick earlier, it would only be fitting to end this video by informing you that, in his opinion, Justinian's arbitrary interference with the affairs of the Western Church brought the papal hierarchy to the brink of ruin. Did you catch that, David?
The brink of ruin.
Yeah, I think skateboarding was probably more your thing.
History, basic history.